like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Thomas, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. Thanks for hosting me, man.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on. Obviously, this is the next installment of our series on the occult, digging into the Beilis case in more detail. At this point, I assume there are very few people hopping on part 8, so to speak. So I think we can just jump straight into it. So where should we start when we're talking about this case?
Yeah, the issue with the Beilis case, and in the previous episode, I sort of wanted to dedicate our discussion to laying foundation. And I'm very meticulous when it comes to analyzing factual records of court proceedings. It's a habit I never really shook off from when I was practicing law. And the kind of law I practiced, I was an appellate attorney. That's very much, I mean, you argue from the factual record as well as, the record of proceedings and the testimonial record. So that colors my research strategy. And I think in subject matter like this, it's appropriate to be meticulous. The issue with the Beilis case, like I said, aside from the obvious disturbing subject matter that's relevant to the broader topic of atavistic and occultic practices being emergent in the modern era in the present day, but also the Beilis case, it very much was the Russian Empire's parallel to the Dreyfus affair and the Leo Frank case, but in some ways it was even more significant. And I'll get into what I mean. It wasn't just polarizing in the way the Dreyfus case was, but for a whole 12 to 15 years prior to Red October, there was a very violent give and take between radicalized Jews from the Pale Settlement and the Tsarist regime, and specifically the Tsarist police force and elements of the Duma who were trying to manumit the peasantry and bring a lot of them into the ranks of the kulaks. And of course, the kulaks were many right-wing organizations like the Black Hundreds and traditionalist outfits, many of which were under arms, like drew from this class. So these people very much drew the ire of these radical Jewish elements. Even partisan Jews who wouldn't be on the same side ordinarily were very committed to this. And so the Beilis case involved all of these things, and it's an incredibly complicated case. So forgive me if I'm hopping around a lot because I don't want to leave anything out. And I've known of the case for a long time, but I've just started really deep diving into it. But it's far from a truly complete record. But to set the stage once again, because this is important, Purim in 1911, began at nightfall on Monday, March 13th, and it ended on sunset on Tuesday, March 14th. Yashinsky, the victim, the little boy who was murdered, he was abducted on March 12th. Okay, so if this was a ritual murder, and again, the court established that it was, they found that there was reasonable doubt as per Beilis's guilt, but they concluded that this was a ritual murder, okay? And I think that matters. And again, the rebuttal is, well, this was a Tsarist court. They were doctrinally anti-Semitic. It's like, well, if that was the case, why was Beilis acquitted? Okay. So on March 20th, essentially a week after he was abducted and murdered, the boy's body was found literally in a cave on the outskirts of Kiev, on the banks of the Dnieper River, or the Dnieper. I can never pronounce these Slavonic names.
Well, it also seems like a sidebar issue.
Yeah.
Anything related to Ukraine has been repronounced, like the way that we're supposed to anglicize it, in the last 3 years.
Right.
So whichever way you are saying it is wrong.
Okay.
And there's a woman from NPR going to tell you how to say it. Yeah.
Right. Just like the rat man at Kiev's name isn't Vladimir's Vaholodemir. But
it's Kiev with
yeah,
ever more vowels.
Yeah. The Somali of the Earls. But it very quickly, the body was identified as Andrei Yashinsky, who'd been missing, and there'd been this frantic search underway. His body was in a seated position. His hands were bound behind his back. He was dressed only in a shirt, underwear, and one sock. And again, there was no evidence he'd been molested or anything. There was 47 puncture wounds on the body. The wounds to the head, specifically the left temple and neck, they'd resulted in fatal blood loss, exsanguination. I think I mentioned last time the blood loss was so copious that the body was literally almost completely empty of blood. Okay. The official cause of death, according to the autopsy, was a wound to the heart having been punctured. And to be clear, there was less than 1/3 of the total volume of blood remaining in Andrei Yashinsky's body. The rest had been lost to the cerebral veins, arteries in the left temple, veins in the neck, and the carotid artery. And to be clear, he wasn't lying in a pool of dried blood. Okay, it was basically a bloodless body that was found, sitting up. And I think as we got into last session, the murder weapon was an awl, AWL, and which you and the fellas advised me of it's used for puncturing leather. You can poke holes through tough material with it. An unusual murder weapon, to say the least. So it wasn't until July 22nd, 1911, that the police finally arrested Beilis. The local police chief who had jurisdiction was a police chief, Mishtuchik. And Mishtuchik was abruptly fired and ultimately imprisoned for accepting bribes. So very abruptly, he was out of the picture, and an Inspector Krasovsky took over the investigation. And Krasovsky becomes a significant figure in all of this. And if you deep dive into ADL copy going back decades, or Van Vishem kind of stuff, they hold out Krasovsky as this big hero, as this righteous Gentile who stood up to the anti-Semitic Tsarist regime. It's really interesting, and anecdotally that tends to substantiate one aspect of my theory of this case and what happened. But the key witnesses were the Shaberyak children. They were Velya, Xenia, and Ludmila. And they testified that on March 12th, 1911, Andrei Yashinsky, who was their friend, their schoolmate, he went to a seminary type prep school, but they were the same age, and they weren't classmates, I don't believe, but they were friends. And Andre asked them to go play in the clay pit, which was adjacent to the brick factory that Beilis ran, and that some of his relatives owned. It wasn't clear to me if the owners were Beilis's blood relatives or just some friends or relatives by marriage, owing the Jewish kind of familial geography. But in any event, the Cheberiak children testified that, when they were playing in the clay pit, Beilis snuck up on them with 2 accomplices and caught Xenia and Andre, and Xenia broke free and ran. But Beilis and these 2 other men, they took Andre into this nearby building abutting the factory. So obviously the Cheberiak children, I mean, this was key to the state's case. Their testimony was the only evidence of what happened. I mean, it was the only direct testimony of what happened, but I mean, it was really the only evidence, period. I mean, especially pre-forensics. Okay, you find a dead body, it appears that there's a ritual aspect, but I mean, beyond that, there's nothing. There's really no way you can prove up a case in chief against any particular defendant just based on that. So Krasovsky took to visiting and interrogating the children, as material witnesses. And he started bringing them and their families cakes and foodstuffs as gifts. Now, very rapidly, Xenia and Valia just died, and Ludmila became very, very sick. And according to the press, the children had died of dysentery. Okay, and obviously, what's long been suspected, and what's suspected and alleged at the time, was that Krasovsky poisoned these witnesses. Okay, Ludmila ultimately recovered, and she did testify, and it's a very sad and very disturbing scenario that she describes. And there's really, I can't think of any incentive for her to lie about it. This was a young child, under or right about 12 years old. I mean, I suppose people would suggest that she could have been vetted by the police to implicate Beilis, but again, who exactly would have vetted her that way? Krasovsky, such that he was compromised in favor of the defendant. But what she testified to was, their mother went to town to market, and her siblings, Xenia and Valia, were sleeping. And then Andre called from the street, to go play. The children got dressed, went to play in the clay mine, where there was more children present initially. And then Beilis very quickly emerged with his Confederates. And Ludmila attested that she thought that, they were going to yell at them or scold them or spank them for, playing in the clay pit. But it quickly became clear that their intention was to kidnap them. So they ran. And, as indicated a minute ago, Xenia escaped, but Andre couldn't. And they grabbed him by the hands and ran off. The prosecution asked, why didn't you report this when it happened? And she said, I told my grandmother, and my grandmother told me not to speak of this. And to be clear, and we'll get into this as we dive into this case, Beilis was a powerful man. He had a lot of clout, and not just as sort of a big man among the Pale Settlement Jews who were then living in Kiev, but he was wealthy and he was connected. And the Kiev Jewish community, they didn't have political power in formal terms, but they were very much a mafia, and people were afraid of them, and In particular, there was one very high-profile political homicide that framed the proceedings. Once the formal proceedings got underway against Beilis, this was a very unsubtle reality, and for those two who don't accept that Krasovsky was compromised, Lyudmila Chebryak, she testified to the fact of, him bringing them what was almost certainly tainted foodstuffs. So as Lyudmila's testimony continues, the judge interjects and says, "Why are you crying?" Lyudmila says, "I'm scared." The chief prosecutor says, "Who brought you the cakes?" The food in question that was presumably poisoned. Lyudmila says, "Vigranov and Krasovsky." Vigranov was one of Krasovsky's deputies. Prosecutor says, "Do you know them?" And she says, "I know them." And the prosecutor says, "Did anybody threaten you?" And she says, "Polshitschtuk." I don't know who that is, and I couldn't find it in the record. But the way the prosecutor frames the question, he's trying to demonstrate the witness was intimidated. So I assume Polshitschtuk was in some capacity working with the police. And so the prosecutor continues, "What did Krasovsky say to you?" Lyudmila says that I wasn't to say any more than 2 or 3 words. Continuing, the judge interjects again, "Why are you crying? No one's going to hurt you here." Lyudmila says, I'm scared. They said if I testified, they would do the same thing to me that they did to Andre. And that's the official record. Okay. And mind you, this is a little kid, peasant stock. I mean, yeah, these people were suburbanites, but these were not complicated people or educated people. I'm not saying that to be mean. That's just the reality. Who were devising all sorts of intrigues because they didn't like Jews or whatever. Now, this becomes significant, what I'm about to get into. As I said, Beilis wasn't arrested until July. The proceedings didn't get underway until months subsequent. That September 18th, 1911, the Russian prime minister, who was also the Tsar's interior minister, Pyotr Stolypin, he was assassinated in this very public and gruesome act of political murder. He was at the opera. It was at the opera house. I don't know if a symphony was underway or an opera, but his killer was this Jewish radical named Dmitry Bogrov. And there's all sorts of obfuscation as to what Bogrov's motives were. Okay, because Stolypin had a reputation as a reformer. In fact, there's this whole package of reform initiatives that was branded the Stolypin Reforms. Go ahead.
He was, and this is sort of the story of Russian anarchism and revolutionary communism, which is that in much the same way that the John Brown raid hardened opinions on both sides, which would ultimately lead to the Civil War. The way in which many people, Stolypin and then several Russian monarchs as well, faced assassination when they attempted to compromise, liberalize, or reform. Hardened opinion among the working class. Interesting issue. I'll throw it back to you, Thomas.
Yeah, no, that's important and that's insightful. And I believe too, Stolypin, he was known to have a conciliatory attitude towards the Pale Settlement Jews, but a big a big priority of his was to try and sort of assimilate them into Russian society and sort of try to socially engineer these pathologies out of existence between them and, the ethnic majority in Ukraine and in Russia proper. So obviously, to your point, whacking a man like him would have the effect of serving a tension strategy and removing conciliatory aspects and people who promote those sorts of solutions from the proverbial chessboard. But also, I think it was I think part of the message was demonstrating will and capability, saying we can do this and we can hit you no matter who you are. And there was real fear that if Beilis wasn't convicted, there'd be this mass uprising of angry Slavic peasants who'd be out for blood to pogrom the Jews. And there definitely were elements within the State Duma who wanted to settle accounts with the Jews owing to ethno-sectarian hostility and other things. I think it was a way of Jewish radicals to reach out and say, if you start hitting us for political expediency, we're going to hit you back. But because the man they hit was a moderate, that wouldn't, inflame the Black Hundreds in the same way as if they'd murdered a man who was, some uncompromising right-wing patriot or something. It's very complicated, but it's also very sophisticated, I think. But this was not accidental, and the reason I raise it isn't just because it's an issue of material fact related to the record under discussion, but it conveys the real fear people had of, mobilized Jewry. This wasn't some wretched, pathetic, kind of put upon class of people who had no power or something. They were very frightening people, and they were powerful people, and people were scared of them. And interestingly, a lot of Beilis's allies, including some of his defense team, and he had a very high-powered defense team, they started going around saying, well, it was probably some gypsies who captured this poor boy and sacrificed him because, they actually do engage in blood rituals. So the prosecutor says, so what are you saying here? You're saying that this kind of thing's impossible in the modern era and that it's some slanderous myth, against the Jewish community, but now you're turning around and saying this does happen, but it's these other people who do it, and that's preposterous. So there was a very angry discourse around this, and a lot of fear and a lot of real intrigues. And to be clear too, when in one of the major newspapers, it was called the Kievskaya Misl, which I believe translates as Kiev Thought. What it reported when the body was discovered was, quote, when the body of the unfortunate boy was carried out of the pit, the crowd shuddered and sobbing could be heard. The aspect of the slain victim was terrible. His face was dark blue and covered with blood, and several windings of a strong cord which cut into his skin were wrapped around the arms. There were 3 wounds on his head, all which came from some kind of piercing tool. The same wounds were also on the face and on both sides of the neck. When the boy's shirt was lifted up, the chest, back, abdomen showed the same piercing wounds. So, this was a very sensational case. Like I said, it became an international news story, quite literally over the wire, when there was an actual telegraph wire that conveyed the news of the day from across the oceans. It it came to frame what was a very real ethno-sectarian conflict that was threatening to become real warfare between populations, and which, in my opinion, did. That's Kevin McDonald's whole point, and he got into this the other week when he was kind of appearing on my pod. That Czechia was something like 70% Jewish, and they killed a huge amount of people. Interestingly, the prosecutor on this case, he was murdered outright by the Bolsheviks in 1917. And one of the expert witnesses of the prosecution was this Roman Catholic priest, and I'll get into his testimony in a minute, who testified as to the ritual aspects of the killing. And he also was an expert in the Talmud and the Kabbalah and the Torah, and like most priests of the day, he was fluent and he could read Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek. He was murdered too by the communists. Basically, everybody who was involved in this case on the state side was immediately murdered as soon as the communists were able to get a hold of them. The degree to which the Russian Revolution was in part a race war can't be overstated. You don't need to accept the rest of Dr. McDonald's theoretical paradigm to acknowledge that. It's indisputable. Let me find my place here. Like I said, there's a huge volume of information, so I'm sorry for the pauses and the sort of scattershot organization or lack thereof. And to be clear too, the people who sided with Beilis as well as his defense team, at first they were trying to direct suspicion. They were trying to throw suspicion on everybody, from these non-existent gypsies that supposedly were prone to sacrificing children in the night. But they started emphasizing the boy's stepfather as a good suspect. And supposedly he murdered the boy because the family was impoverished, and he wanted to free himself from his obligation to support a child that wasn't his. But then the prosecution produced witnesses that the stepfather loved the boy and was a caring father and was devastated by his murder. So then the defense quickly pivoted, trying to hang it on other relatives and other people within the community. There was a powerful media guy, Ukrainian Jewish guy, who was very active in the community, and as sort of an ethno-sectarian partisan, Borshevsky. And Borshevsky was very avidly publishing this kind of disinformation, and it was he who really brought public pressure to bear for the disgraced police chief Mitschuk, who was ultimately imprisoned. It was Borshevsky who really brought to bear public pressure for him to be removed and then indicted, and he continued in the vein of that narrative even after the man was formally charged as saying Mitschuk had orchestrated some kind of conspiracy to protect powerful people who shall not be named and to scapegoat the Jewish community. There's also echoes of Epstein here. I'm not trying to sensationalize this or be crude or something, but there's very much an MO, that over temporal and cultural and historical distance remains constant. And that can't be denied either, and nor going to be dismissed as irrelevant or somehow slanderous. And it's also too, it does raise the question. I'm not suggesting, I don't think anybody would, that genuine instances of public corruption should be ignored so as not to render processes of the law enforcement and the criminal judiciary more difficult. But it doesn't seem particularly timely to swap out the chief of police where there's a sensational politically charged murder case. Is that really the ideal time to bring?
Yeah, it stretches the limits of credibility. Look, I get it. Personnel change happens, but somewhat similar to losing the footage when a prominent billionaire allegedly kills himself after being implicated in a case. Yeah, I'm sure it happens, but when it happens, give me a second.
Yeah.
All right, cool. When it happens in a case that has quite literally got the intention of the entire nation, it bears investigation, perhaps.
And it's unseemly. Yeah. And especially in the case at Barr, or like in the record before us, not only was Krasovsky, he was very much obviously everything but an advocate and all but name for the defendant. That doesn't seem coincidental, and nor was. And to be clear, the reason why I raised the issue of the children's testimony, that testimony is disturbing and damning for all kinds of reasons. But there was a good ID made here, and these kids knew who Beilis was. So it's like, okay, they're children, but that children are perfectly capable of rendering a positive identification. This wasn't a matter of the secret police grabbing Beilis because they didn't like him or because he was the one Jew who lived in proximity to the murder scene or something. He was made by 3 witnesses, and not just witnesses. These witnesses claimed he and his comrades attacked them. This wasn't an issue of him being sighted at distance by strangers or something. These were very intimate and frightening circumstances for these kids. You can't dismiss that as being inherently compromised by the intrinsic unreliability of eyewitness testimony. This is one of the rare cases, or one of the comparatively rare cases, where eyewitness testimony really does pack monumental persuasive weight, I think. And to be clear too, just to set the scene, this brick factory and this clay quarry, it was on the edge of Kiev, and the brickyard, it was owned by this Jewish businessman named Zaitsev. And it was in proximity to a disused Jewish hospital, the dining hall of which had been repurposed as a prayer room. In part, this was done so to get around zoning restrictions about where synagogues could be and things. And frequently rabbis were observed coming and going from there. So the whole place was a religious center, okay, for the Jews of Kiev. And a lot of powerful men and big men in the community spent time there. And Beilis, he'd been appointed by one of these rabbinic types, name of Mendel. Beilis had been appointed as, quote, guard and attendant. So that's the connection there. It wasn't just that Beilis had a business interest, that he happened to be wandering around that day or something. And this was a heavily Jewish area within immediate proximity to this complex were a circle of 7 Jewish extended families, and only 2 non-Jews lived in immediate proximity to the premises. So not only was this site a place that had sacramental significance, but it's also a place where, brazen as it was and is to grab children like that, but this is a place where Beilis would have felt safe. If he did anywhere doing something like that.
His home turf, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this was obviously well known to local authorities, like all these facts. And owing to the nature of the property and the fact that it was a literal quarry and the cave where the victim was found, abutted that quarry, this whole premises could have been very easily cordoned off without even a particularly large police presence. And that's what should have been done immediately after the discovery of the body, but nothing like that happened. There wasn't any evidentiary work conducted in the brickyard. The building wasn't searched for fingerprints or blood evidence or anything. And just days later, the interior of a shed abutting the clay pit was just suddenly given a new coat of whitewash paint. And this didn't raise the ire of the police. They just let that happen. And it wasn't until several days later that, and mind you, the body wasn't discovered until a week after the boy had gone missing. And presumably, he was murdered on Purim. So this was already a week after the murder. And then there was, another several days before the police processed the crime scene. And during that time, the owners of the premises were free to do whatever they wanted. And this is not consistent with a murder investigation. And again, this wasn't the middle of nowhere. It was the Kiev suburbs. And, the czarist secret police, I'm not going to go as far as to say they were Scotland Yard or the New York Police Department, which even back then was fairly cutting edge in terms of police science knowledge and capabilities. This wasn't in the middle of nowhere, and these cops were habituated to processing murder scenes and things, and there was, quite strikingly too, even there was a subpopulation of baptized Jews, so I guess could be viewed as Marranos, as it were. First among them was a man named Brightman. He was the publisher of a Jewish cultural newspaper, and he continued to hammer the claim of the defense that this alleged roving band of gypsies were responsible for the murder. And in this paper, it referred again and again to the quote blood superstition of the gypsy race. And this again, this raised the ire not just of the prosecution, but of the literate Slavic Christian public. And their obviously their rebuttal was, how can you say that? It's like, okay, so you claim you're a baptized Jew, so you accept Christ. But now you're saying that it's a slander to suggest that, you know, Jews practice blood rituals. While in the same sentence, you're claiming that there's a quote blood superstition that is supposed to exist among these gypsies, you know, who have yet to be identified. You know, it's very transparent, and that's one of the things that. Go ahead.
Just sorry, an aside. It's sort of interesting that they accept the premise that it was a ritual murder. Either that seemed to have been widely accepted by almost everyone involved in this, regardless of, I mean, even in what we could consider maybe a biased source such as that newspaper.
I think it's because they couldn't really get away from it. I mean, it's an upsetting subject matter, obviously, so most people prefer not to think about it, but look at it like this. When a child is murdered, almost always it's one of two things. It's either a parent who murdered the child because they got carried away when they were disciplining the child, you know, by way of beating them, or it's some sort of paraphilic sexual homicide. So when you have a little boy, he wasn't sexually molested. He wasn't murdered by a parent, you know, or by like a drunk, enraged parent. He didn't expire in the course of a disciplinary beating. He's murdered by strangers, and his body's discovered, obviously posed, drained of blood. You know how you can't really get away from the ritual aspect of that. You can't claim it's something it's not. And even if playing devil's advocate, somebody suggests, well, not all erotic paraphilias are overtly and physically sexual. Okay, so what was the paraphilia? What was it? You know, there's nothing that can substantiate the allegation. And Russian courts, I don't know for certain, because I don't know anything about the Russian legal system. I speculate, particularly after Peter the Great's reforms, I speculate that Russian courts, particularly in these major municipalities like Kiev or Moscow or St. Petersburg or whatever, I speculate they basically proceeded, you know, in an inquisitorial way, in the way that, similar to the way that civil courts and criminal courts do on the European continent. And the judge is not just the trier of fact, but he has like an investigative role, you know, and so the court was charged not just with determining the guilt of Beilis, because unlike in America, like police always say, you know, motive means and opportunity is what constitutes a crime. Okay, that may be, but in a court of law, if I'm the state, I don't have to prove shit for motive. It's not an element of the offense, and it doesn't matter. I mean, it's relevant. I can introduce it into evidence of motive, and if there's a lay jury, generally it helps them develop a conceptual picture, and it can be persuasive. Or alternatively, if I'm defense counsel, I can point to lack of motive in order to raise reasonable doubt. But it's not an aspect of the offense, and it's not the trier of fact and the trier of law. They're neither of their roles is to determine what the motive is, but it's different in a European court. And what I presume was the Tsarist court, which reflected those tendencies too. So the court's basically not just the trier of law, but it's also on a fact-finding mission. You know, and so yeah, it is interesting and it's highly significant. And also there was echoes of I'll save that till we're off record. Not because I was going to say something sinister, but I don't want to go down a rabbit hole with the time we got left. But yeah, no. And it's something I keep raising the issue of these partisan media outlets because, again, Kiev was comparatively literate, like the whole municipality for the Russian Empire. You know, and this was an example, like the Dreyfus affair. There really was a war being waged in media over the Beilis affair, and I that was really the first time that it happened in the Russian Empire, or it's probably the first time that it really gotten underway in an Eastern Slavic country, unless you count some of the Habsburg territories or whatever. But yeah, so there's a lot going on here beyond the obvious. The Krasovsky too, this cop who again was, almost certainly, in my opinion, it poisoned these child witnesses. It's speculated that he was being paid large sums of money by Beilis himself and some of his powerful allies. And, I've heard it suggested, or I've read it suggested, that this was his plan from jump, was to extort money. And there was some sort of financial arrangement between Krasovsky and Beilis' defense team. And court historians dismiss that as, well, this is just typical. This is a typical corruption of czarist officialdom, whereby negotiation for grafts began immediately after the arrest of a high-profile defendant. But I've never heard of that before in this context, or in a similar context. Like, what other high-profile defendant had the lead investigator on a murder case, no less a sensational murder case that went out over the global newswire, was consistently being paid by the defense team in order to act in that disruptive role, or to even go as far as acting as a de facto agent of the defense itself. This is what I'm getting at, is that there's nothing there. It's just polemic and speculation derived from polemical argument by assertion. And interestingly, I didn't get a direct source for this statement, and some of these books and articles that were written in the contemporaneous with the trial and then immediately subsequent, they're all in Russian. So I'm reading stuff that was translated by friends of ours and also just academics who, are posting these documents up on blogs and stuff that dedicated to the case and the subject matter. Apparently, some declarant associated with the prosecution said, quote, "The Jews are judicially without rights, but in reality, they have all of Russia in their hands. The promise has come into its fulfillment." I don't know what that means. "We all feel that we are under the yoke of an all-powerful Jewry. We may be called enemies of progress and obstructionists, but we cannot close our eyes to the corpse of Yashinsky. The Jews accuse us of inciting the people against them, but that they themselves want to keep the peace. They know that Beilis is guilty, and because of that, they seek to confuse the case, to put it on a false track," end quote. And that, I submit that not to say, that's true and accurate, although it might be. That was the perspective of the state, and these people, like that poor Ludmilla, who was saying to the court again and again, "I'm afraid." This was not some powerless minority on the fringes of of Russian imperial life or something. These were very powerful people who had an outsized influence on every aspect of national life. And there's I don't know if this was formally proffered as evidence, and again, I don't know anything about Imperial Russian court procedure and what can get into evidence. It's very complicated. It always is, whatever judicial system you're discussing. But at some point, there was a discussion. I don't know if it was the equivalent of in chambers or if it was an open court about the precedent for Jewish ritual sacrifice. And there's a number of instances referenced of alleged facts and circumstances in common with those around the Beilis case. And like I said, this Roman Catholic priest who was responsible for he was the prelate of the Kiev region, I believe it would be, and I speculate that this foundational stuff about the history of alleged or documented Jewish ritual sacrifice was foundational in order to substantiate what the relevance was of his testimony. Towards that end, or consistent with that discussion, there was a Theodore Fritsch who testified that one Solomon Schneerson was condemned to death in 1797 due to a proven allegation of blood ritual murder. But he was subsequently, upon being condemned to death, he was subsequently freed thanks to the intervention of a powerful elder named Petretz. Similarly, a grandson of Schneerson named Mendel Schneerson, he was involved in a similar blood murder trial. I mean, crazy as that might seem, in 1852 in Saratov, where a boy about the same age as Andrei Yachinsky named Chestobatov was murdered. And right around the same time of year, in March, proximate to Purim. So I mean, there was this was not unprecedented. And you've got to believe that if you're gonna, if the claim is that none of these instances were there, in none of these instances was there merit to the allegations. What would the incentive be? Like, what would be the point of maintaining this charade of court process? It's not. I mean, pogroms happened in the Russian Empire. It's if you want to pogrom the Jews, you don't need to convene a kangaroo court to do it. And it's not as if Jews are particularly well liked anyway. It's not as if people needed to be inculcated with a hostility to the Pale Settlement Jews or something by way of some sort of exhibition of farcical court proceedings. another case in January 1853. There was another boy named Maslow who'd been kidnapped, and his body was discovered later with dozens of wounds. The body washed up on the Volga. There was evidence of post-mortem circumcision, and a pattern of injury almost identical to the case at Bar. So I mean, there's something here, okay? And I mean, even if all these cases, even if they were not officially sanctioned by some rabbinic body of elders or something, even if it was just disturbed individual actors whose activities weren't being sanctioned by any congregational authority or anything else, it's like, well, I mean, why does this pathology emerge again and again within this discrete population? Yeah.
Within the same group, the same community, separated by an immense amount of time and distance. Right? I'll give anyone one. Right? You have one crazy guy goes off. It happens.
Yeah. No, exactly.
But at a certain point, you start to look at these anecdotes, and you can make some sort of assumption. Right? You can draw a conclusion from the data shown. And to your point, again, like if pogroms were something that happened, and if this was merely a justification, well, one, they didn't always pull that out. Like if that was the traditional, like, oh, we found a guy, now it's time to go on a pogrom, you could say, okay. But to your point, it's like, well, they clearly did not feel the need to always create a sort of a spectacular crime as a justification. So using that as a way to dismiss this is it seems to be sort of, I guess, motivated reasoning.
No, 100%. And also, yeah, and I mean, and to the point of the declarant who I cited a minute ago, the Jews in Kiev were powerful. It's like you wouldn't want to just pick a fight with these people as some kind of opportunity target. And I think that's lost, and people either abide this narrative where they like we talked about last time. I think they either think that the Pale Settlement Jews had lived among the Russians for thousands of years or something, or in lieu of just a couple of centuries, which is the reality, or they think that the experience of the Jews was like it was in the Levant, where the Caliphate, really did abuse them and kept them locked behind ghetto walls, and they had no rights whatsoever, and they weren't doing business, they weren't, getting any respect or any there was no manumission for them at all in any sector of public or or economic affairs. And that's not the case at all. This was a very powerful group of people. I realize I got to wrap in a second, but I found my notes on the priest was Pranitis, and his testimony was essential in establishing the ritual nature of the homicide. And again, he was LB or IB Pranitis. He was a professor of the Hebrew language at Petrograd, St. Petersburg, or Leningrad, for those who don't know. At the Petrograd Roman Catholic Theological Academy, he was fluent in Hebrew and Latin and Greek. He was an expert in the Talmud. So he was, and he was the curator of all the Catholic churches in the Turkestan region, which was the equivalent of a bishop. And again, too, like if this was just a czarist charade, anti-Semitic charade, why wouldn't they call an Orthodox priest? Why would they call an outsider? And like, why would he be interested in playing ball with this charade too? I mean, but yeah, well, if you're amenable to wrapping this up in the next episode, I'll get into the testimony of Pronitis. And
Yeah, of course.
yeah, okay, that's great. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's your show. I don't want to dictate terms. And like I said, I corralled like 50 pages of notes on this, and the documentary record is just huge. So forgive me for being kind of all over the place.
Oh, not at all. As
Okay.
you can probably tell, I was traveling late last night, and my brain is functioning at about 60% capacity. So I wasn't doing you any favors either. But Thomas, looking forward to the next episode. If people want to find you, obviously your website, your Substack, our shared project on Gumroad, there are many ways to do that. I think everyone, myself included, are eagerly expecting your long form content whenever that comes out. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I think I've said this a couple times, but this is what I do now. If you want to support me, you can get these episodes early and ad free on Patreon or Substack. Again, Thomas, man, it was great talking to you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, buddy.
Everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.